I initiated the most dangerous experiment of my life by hiring a team of elite ethical hackers. My objective was to systematically dismantle my digital existence, to expose the vulnerabilities that left me exposed. I sought to uncover the hidden gaps that invited identity theft and the threat of financial ruin. However, the reality of this controlled chaos proved to be far more harrowing than I ever anticipated. Within mere hours, they had bypassed my multi-factor authentication with a terrifying and surgical level of precision. They accessed my private cloud storage, exposing years of personal data that I thought was securely locked. Soon, they began rerouting my automated bill payments to a series of sophisticated and untraceable fraudulent accounts. As I sat in my home office, the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and anxiety. I was frantically trying to patch security holes and reset encrypted passwords that were rapidly failing me. The hackers remained 2 steps ahead, mocking my desperate efforts through cryptic messages left in my history. Each message was a cruel reminder that my digital sanctuary had been turned into a hunting ground. The thrill of the initial challenge quickly evaporated, leaving behind a cold and suffocating sense of dread. I realized that my entire financial infrastructure was crumbling under the weight of their calculated, relentless assault. My screen flickered with red warnings, signaling that my savings were being drained by invisible digital hands. Every keystroke I made felt like a futile attempt to hold back a rising, unstoppable tide of data. I watched in horror as my bank portals displayed unauthorized transactions that I could no longer stop. The walls of my digital life were closing in, and the silence of the room felt deafening. My pulse quickened as I realized that my identity was being disassembled piece by agonizing piece tonight. I was desperate to regain control before my bank accounts hit zero and left me completely destitute. The hackers were not just testing my defenses, they were dismantling the very foundation of my life. I stared at the blinking cursor, waiting for the next strike to shatter my remaining digital defenses. My hands trembled as I navigated through layers of compromised security, searching for a single stable anchor. The screen displayed a mocking notification, confirming that yet another layer of my privacy had been breached. I felt like a ghost in my own machine, watching my life being erased by faceless, digital adversaries. The complexity of their code was staggering, a testament to the power they held over my existence. I tried to isolate the network, but they had already established backdoors that bypassed my physical hardware. Every attempt to lock them out only triggered more aggressive scripts that further destabilized my personal accounts. The realization hit me that my entire existence was now merely a series of vulnerable, exposed data. I was trapped in a labyrinth of my own making, with no clear path to escape the siege. The flickering light of the monitor cast long, distorted shadows against the walls of my dark office. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I watched the progress bars of their malware crawl across my monitor. It was a slow, methodical execution of my financial stability, performed with cold and calculated digital efficiency. I attempted to force a system reboot, hoping to sever their connection before the final transfer completed. The machine ignored my commands, effectively locking me out of the very hardware I had purchased myself. A sense of utter helplessness washed over me as the screen turned a deep, warning shade of crimson. They had successfully hijacked my administrative privileges, turning my own security protocols against my personal interests. I reached for my phone to call the bank, but the signal had been completely jammed by them. Every avenue of communication was severed, leaving me isolated within the confines of my own compromised home. The hackers were playing a game of cat and mouse, and I was clearly the cornered prey. I watched as my credit score plummeted in real time, a digital representation of my life falling apart. The sheer speed of their operation indicated they had been planning this breach for several long weeks. I felt the weight of my past mistakes, each one a vulnerability they were now ruthlessly exploiting. My digital footprint, once a source of pride, had become a roadmap for my total financial destruction. I tried to access my backup drives, but they had already encrypted those files with unbreakable, complex algorithms. There was no turning back now, as the damage was already deep within the core of my network. I sat motionless, mesmerized by the relentless flow of data being siphoned away into the dark void. The hum of the computer fans grew louder, mirroring the frantic pounding of my own racing heart. I wondered if they were watching me through the webcam, laughing at my pathetic and futile struggle. The thought made me shudder, yet I could not tear my eyes away from the unfolding disaster. Every second that passed felt like an hour, dragging me closer to the brink of complete ruin. I had invited them in to test my strength, but they had exposed my absolute, pathetic weakness. The irony of the situation was not lost on me, even as my world was collapsing entirely. I was paying for my own destruction, funding the very people who were currently erasing my life. The screen suddenly went black, leaving me in a suffocating, heavy silence that felt like a tomb. I waited for a sign, a message, or even a final taunt from my unseen digital tormentors. The cursor blinked once in the center of the dark screen, a final, mocking heartbeat of light. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers trembling as the cold surface met my skin. The experiment had spiraled far beyond my control, leaving me stranded in a sea of digital wreckage. I stared at my reflection in the dark monitor, barely recognizing the desperate, hollow man looking back. The siege was complete, and I was left with nothing but the echoes of my own failure. The final stage of the simulation pushed me to the brink of total collapse. As the hackers initiated a simulated bankruptcy, freezing my assets and locking me out of my primary banking portals, leaving me stranded in a sea of digital red tape. I realized that defense was no longer about blocking individual attacks or patching holes, but about fundamentally restructuring my digital identity from the ground up, starting from scratch. Utilizing a secure, offline terminal, I executed a scorched earth policy to stop the bleeding, purging compromised accounts and establishing a hardened perimeter that even my hired adversaries struggled to penetrate, as I methodically erased every trace of my previous vulnerable digital footprint. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, inputting complex commands into the dark screen, while the silence of my home office amplified the frantic beating of my heart. I watched the progress bars crawl across the monitor, each one a battle for survival, against the relentless tide of code that threatened to erase my entire financial existence. The hackers, once mocking and playful, now seemed to falter against my new, rigid defenses, their attempts to breach my firewall failing as I tightened the encryption protocols further. By the time the clock ran out, I had successfully reclaimed my financial autonomy, though the experience left me permanently altered, scarred by the intensity of the struggle. I emerged not just with a secure bank account, but with a profound, chilling understanding of how fragile our modern lives truly are in this interconnected, digital world. The hackers finally stood down, acknowledging my success with a single, respectful notification ping, but the silence that followed was heavy with the knowledge of my narrow escape. I stared at the screen, seeing the reflection of a man who had stared into the abyss of total ruin and managed to pull himself back from oblivion. The digital landscape, once a tool of convenience, now felt like a minefield of hidden dangers waiting for the slightest mistake to trigger a catastrophic collapse of security. I realized that in the digital age, we are all just one breach away from total oblivion, a terrifying truth that would haunt my every future online interaction. My hands trembled as I finally powered down the terminal, the hum of the machine fading into the oppressive quiet of the room, marking the end of chaos. The simulation was over, but the lessons learned were etched into my mind forever, reminding me that true security is a constant, exhausting battle against an unseen enemy. I stood up from my desk, my legs feeling heavy as I walked toward the window to look out at the city lights, which now seemed like flickering signals of a vast, vulnerable network that could vanish at any given moment today. The experiment had achieved its goal, exposing the cracks in my digital armor that I had ignored for far too long, leaving me wiser but deeply, profoundly unsettled. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as the reality of my survival settled in, a hollow victory against a foe that never truly existed. The hackers were gone, their digital shadows dissolved into the ether, leaving me alone, with the remnants of my shattered confidence and a newfound, cautious respect for privacy. I would never look at a login screen or a bank statement the same way again, knowing the fragility hidden behind the polished interfaces of our daily lives. The screen remained dark, a black mirror reflecting the uncertainty of my future path, as I contemplated the steps needed to maintain this hard-won, fragile sense of safety. Every password, every account, and every digital connection now felt like a potential liability, demanding constant vigilance in a world that prioritized convenience over true, robust security measures. I walked back to the terminal one last time, ensuring the encryption was absolute, a final act of defiance against the chaos that had nearly consumed my life. The weight of the experience was a physical burden, a reminder that the digital siege had been a mirror of my own internal vulnerabilities and lack of preparation. I turned off the lights, letting the darkness envelop the room as I processed the long, harrowing journey from total exposure to a state of guarded, careful autonomy. The silence was no longer heavy with dread, but with a somber, reflective peace, a quiet acceptance of the new reality I had to inhabit from this point. I had survived the siege, but the war for my digital identity would continue, an endless cycle of defense and adaptation in an ever-evolving, dangerous, and complex landscape. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the battle that had just been fought. Within the confines of my office, a secret struggle that defined my new existence. I sat in the dark, watching the faint glow of the power indicator light. A small, steady pulse in the night, symbolizing the resilience I had finally found. The digital age was a trap, but I had learned how to survive it.